Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ezekiel Elliott, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 16 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with the matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 8 through 15 in order to give ourselves more perspective as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into the week. Now, after we talk about that, I'll, of course, also show you guys individualized per team stats that have been given up to opposing running backs. There is still one team that in the last 7 weeks hasn't given up a single touchdown to an opposing running back. That is the Miami Dolphins. But again, we'll talk about that in more detail. After that, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings. I do want to preface that today's video is being recorded before the Philadelphia Eagles Washington football team game and, of course, the Seattle Seahawks Los Angeles Rams game. So I have no idea as to the results of those contests. I am just going to go ahead and present to you guys my overall thought process as to how those players are potentially going to look going into Week 16 based on their matchups and, of course, their performances this season. But that information is still up in the air, and that is why rankings are subject to change. But either way, I'll, of course, give you guys my thought process and opinions in regards to all 36 of the running backs that I'll mention today, and hopefully give you guys more perspective so you can make the most educated decision at the end of the week to help you win in Week 16. Before we begin today's video, of course, if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. We're trying to help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship this season. And if in fact you get into a scenario in which unfortunately Alvin Kamara, Najee Harris, Tom Brady is on your singular team and you end up losing, unfortunately, you're going to be done and your fantasy season will come to an end. But that's not where it ends. You can go ahead and travel to Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit and play in a plethora of contests, whether it is weekly contests like the Tuesday night Rumbles, whether it's Thursday night, Sunday night, the Sunday midday contests, whether it is the Pick'ems, the best ball drafts for the NFL playoffs. There's a lot of ways to have fun. There's a lot of ways to continue to play fantasy football via Underdog Fantasy. So check it out. Use promo code Andrew today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our Week 16 running backs, beginning with matchups at the position. As you can see to the very left of the screen, we have weeks 8 through 15 running back fantasy points allowed from respective defenses. As we typically know, the New York Jets, Pittsburgh Steelers, Las Vegas Raiders, Seattle Seahawks, these are the teams that every single week are giving up the most points to opposing running backs, and those statistics aren't really changing. While on the other end of the spectrum, of course, the Tennessee Titans, Baltimore Ravens, Miami Dolphins, they have been absolutely incredible in terms of stopping the run and, of course, stopping opposing running backs from even getting points in the receiving game altogether. There's just been a complete cohesive enhancement from these defenses that we really hadn't seen coming earlier this season. They really have flipped the script, and that is why it's important to understand, while many of us may look at our given matchups via our ESPN or NFL.com or Yahoo Fantasy apps, it doesn't give us the grand scheme picture. Yes, the entirety of the season, the Miami Dolphins, they gave up a lot of points from weeks 1 through 7. In fact, from weeks 1 through 7, they gave up 10 touchdowns to opposing running backs. But it doesn't take into account that in the last 7 weeks, they've given up 0 touchdowns to opposing running backs. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and break it down in this regard so you understand just how difficult the matchup is and why it'll be extremely difficult for someone like Alvin Kamara, despite how talented he is, to find an incredible amount of success in that given matchup. But either way, now that you see that on the very left, to the right of that, of course, we have weeks 8 through 15 running back rushing stats allowed. I just wanted to go ahead and collect yardage and rushing touchdowns and find the fantasy points that are scored in that two categories, combine them to give you some perspective. For example, there are some running backs in the National Football League that just don't catch the ball, like a Damien Harris. And if in fact you have a matchup in which, of course, that running back is going up against the defense that really just gives up a bunch of points on the ground, it gives us a little bit more confidence in playing that specific player, even in a full half PPR scoring format. But either way, as you can see, the Pittsburgh Steelers, New York Jets, Houston Texans, Detroit Lions, some of the teams that are, of course, on the left side of the screen are, of course, at the top, at the right side, in terms of giving up a bunch of rushing statistics. Either way, now that we've kind of given you guys this perspective, I also want to go ahead and give you some detailed analysis as to how many stats they've given up to opposing running backs. As you can see from weeks 8 through 15, the Miami Dolphins on the very bottom of the screen, they have literally given up 0 touchdowns to opposing running backs. The Baltimore Ravens this last week were on pace with the Miami Dolphins, but A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones had different plans for the Baltimore defense. Both ended up scoring a touchdown, but nonetheless, they are still one of the better defenses against opposing running backs. Either way, you can go ahead and pause the screen, check out these statistics, and kind of give you guys, some more perspective on the matter. But either way, I will be referring to these statistics as we go through the video in terms of talking about who has the best matchups in the given week. All right, let's get into it, shall we? Let's transition to our top 36 running back rankings. Again, rankings are subject to change. By the time we get to Sunday, of course, there are going to be a lot of players that are going to be out or potentially missing or, replaced. I don't know. It's going to be a bunch of craziness this week. Either way, Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be live streaming. So if you want to get some updated rankings, you can show up then, and I'll be sure to help you out. Thank you very much. All right, beginning with our number one, of course, it is Jonathan Taylor. A lot of the guys that we're going to be mentioning in this first page are guys that you're automatically starting, so I don't really have to say much about them. The only thing that I wanted to say is thank you to Jonathan Taylor. Thank you for having a 67-yard rushing touchdown at the end of the game with 2 minutes remaining. Thank you for saving many of our fantasy weeks. Thank you for giving us an influx of 12.7 fantasy points within 5 seconds. You saved our weeks and you are continuing to carry our seasons. This is a man that has had 11 consecutive games of scoring a touchdown. In 10 of those 11 games, he has had 100 plus all-purpose yards. In the one game in which he wasn't able to do that, only had 97. Still pretty good. He's been averaging 147 all-purpose yards in the last 11 consecutive games. He is an unbelievable running back, taking on the Arizona Cardinals on Saturday. I think it's going to be a walk in the park. When we're seeing guys like Craig Reynolds run for over 100 yards on that defense, I mean, imagine what Jonathan Taylor behind this amazing offensive line is going to be able to accomplish. Moving on to our number two, we have Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers. Of course, Austin Ekeler, dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury last week, still was able to put up 16.2 fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs. He has been incredible against them all of his entire career. I mean, going up back until 2018. Either way, has the privilege of taking on the fifth easiest matchup at the running back position, the Houston Texans. Of course, the Houston Texans most recently gave up 24 points to Jonathan Taylor, 26 points to Rashaad Penny, and 16.3 points to James Robinson just this past week. There was a lot of potential for Austin Ekeler to have himself an extremely high upside game. But if in fact we get into a scenario in which Austin Ekeler is limited, similar to the way that he was last week, he only played 34% of the offensive snaps against Kansas City. If he's limited, then of course we'll get 15 points and be done. If he's going to be at a greater capacity, 60 to 70% of the offensive snaps, then we may be able to get a 25-point performance and maybe see Austin Ekeler at the top of the list when it's all said and done in week 16. Moving on to James Robinson, our number three, and the thumbnail for today's video. I have a lot of confidence in James Robinson. The fact that he went from having two unbelievably poor performances in back-to-back weeks to then them firing Urban Meyer and them getting back to running the football. 18 rushing attempts, 75 yards, a rushing touchdown, 6 targets, leading to 3 receptions and 13 receiving yards, 16.3 fantasy points. I mean, it's obviously incredible. On top of the fact that he has the easiest matchup at the running back position, the New York Jets just gave up 25.2 fantasy points. Literally the most fantasy points on the week to a given running back was to Duke Johnson. Let's not forget, Duke Johnson was a practice squad player a couple weeks ago, comes in and dominates 107 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns against this defense in week 15. I think James Robinson, the sky is the limit. I want to talk about a couple things. Carlos Hyde is going to the injured reserve with a concussion. This obviously grants a lot more opportunity for James Robinson in the coming weeks. But of course, the New York Jets, they have allowed 21 fantasy points per game on rushing stats alone, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. They have allowed 14 touchdowns to opposing running backs in just the last 8 games. The New York Jets are an incredible matchup, and James Robinson, I'm sure he's primed and ready for an incredible top 3 performance. Moving on to Ronald Jones. You may be thinking, Andrew, why is Ronald Jones on screen? Well, as long as Leonard Fournette is out this week, which it seems like he's going to be out for multiple weeks here, we have Ronald Jones in an incredible matchup. You may be looking at your Yahoo app or your ESPN Fantasy, NFL.com Fantasy, doesn't matter, and looking at the matchup against the Carolina Panthers, and it may say, oh, it's a difficult matchup or it's in the middle of the pack. Guys, it is a top 10 matchup going into this week. As of late, the Carolina Panthers have been terrible in terms of stopping the run. And not only that, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they have been amazing in terms of running the ball on Carolina in seasons past. So let's talk about it. In the last 4 games alone, the Carolina Panthers are giving up 121 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs and a rushing touchdown per game to opposing running backs. I mean, that's 18 fantasy points up for grabs just off rushing stats alone to opposing running backs in the last 4 weeks. Not only that, we have seen a consistent amount of success from running backs from Tampa Bay against Carolina. Last season, Ronald Jones took them on, and in the game in which he was the starting running back, had 23 carries, 192 yards, and a rushing touchdown for 24.3 fantasy points. In the game in which Leonard Fournette was given the majority of touches against the Carolina Panthers, he had 12 carries, 103 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 25.6 fantasy points. Again, that's 50 fantasy points from last season's Tampa Bay versus Carolina game in which running backs were just killing them. I think they'll get back to that, of course, with Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown finally getting back into the lineup. They're going to be a run-first scheme going into this week. This Carolina defense, in the last 7 weeks of the season, weeks 8 through 15, they've been giving up 21.8 fantasy points per game to opposing running back. It's an incredible matchup. Do not be mistaken. Ronald Jones is an incredible play. Moving on to Dalvin Cook, our number 5. Again, Dalvin Cook had himself a lackluster performance last night, to say the very least, against the Chicago Bears. But it had a lot to do with the fact that Kirk Cousins was, primetime Kirk Cousins, which is the worst type that you can possibly find. Either way, the thing that I wanted to first and foremost mention, the Los Angeles Rams, they are an incredible defense in terms of stopping the run as of late. Since week 8, they've only been giving up 3.07 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. That in itself makes me a little worried. That's the second best in the National Football League since week 8, only behind the Tennessee Titans defense. So when I think about what the potential is of Dalvin Cook, of course, he can score a touchdown. He can get himself 70 rushing yards very easily. He can get himself a lot of work in the receiving game. We just got to get this offense to wake up. We got to get Adam Dillon back there, and we got to get Kirk Cousins out of this kind of slump that he's been in, especially when he plays on primetime television. It'll be a little bit different this week. I think Dalvin Cook, of course, like he typically is, will get back to being top 5 running back. Moving on to Alvin Kamara. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Miami Dolphins matchup is the toughest one going into this week. They have not allowed a single touchdown since week 8. From weeks 1 through 7, like I mentioned earlier on today's episode, they gave up 10 touchdowns in the first 7 games of the season. It's pretty much a complete flip, and there's a reason why the Miami Dolphins have been on a hot streak and been on a 6 consecutive win streak of games here. They're coming back, and they're fighting back as their defense is pretty much carrying that entire scenario. But the thing that worries me about Alvin Kamara, and the reason why he's not a little bit higher, though I do think he's going to find a lot of success with, of course, their offensive coordinator / head coach Sean Payton back. Obviously was not there on Sunday against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The thing that worries me is their right and left tackle are out. And that has been a consistent thing about this offense. Sure, they've been able to survive without them, but if they can get them back, Terron Armstead and Ryan Ramczyk, they'll be a significantly better football team. Not only that, with Mark Ingram active, unfortunately, Alvin Kamara is a significantly lesser back. In fact, he's averaging 6.18 fantasy points less per game when Mark Ingram is active. He's going from about 18 fantasy points per game to about 12 when Mark Ingram is in the lineup. And of course, when you have Taysom Hill also in the lineup, it certainly presents another opportunity for someone to steal some rushing work down in the red zone. Either way, we trust in Alvin Kamara. We trust in the idea that this team is going to succeed regardless of the matchup. But just be careful because there are other opposing threats in his own team, regardless of what's on the other side of the field. Moving on to DeAndre Swift, our number 7. Look, DeAndre Swift should be coming back. It was said from the head coach of the Detroit Lions, MCDC, Motor City Dan Campbell, that he should be back and ready to play after the shoulder injury has held him out for the last 3 weeks. The thing that I wanted to mention, prior to DeAndre Swift's injury, this man has been averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format this season. He takes on the Atlanta Falcons, the 12th easiest matchup at the position. Last week, we saw Jeff Wilson run for 110 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. In the same game, Deebo Samuel had himself 4 rushing attempts for 60 yards, and even Kyle Juszczyk, their fullback, scored a touchdown. There is a lot of value to be found in terms of matchups against the Atlanta Falcons, so why not go ahead, fire up DeAndre Swift. If you've been able to make it this far with one of your mainstay running backs on the bench, and you've been able to make it to week 16, congratulations. I think, dividends will be paid out here via DeAndre Swift in an incredible matchup. I know Craig Reynolds does pose a potential threat in this backfield, but as we all know, DeAndre Swift is going to be the primary receiving back, and also based on what we saw prior to his absence, this guy was getting 130 rushing yards in back-to-back games against Cleveland and Pittsburgh, had himself great performances, and hopefully we'll get back to that against Atlanta this week. Moving on, Cordarrelle Patterson. On the other side of the football, of course, the Atlanta Falcons, yes, they have a pretty easy matchup against Detroit, as Detroit is giving up the 6th most points to opposing running backs. Unfortunately, Cordarrelle Patterson finished week 15 with 3.3 fantasy points, but just want to go ahead and give you some perspective. Cordarrelle Patterson had a touchdown called. Unfortunately, they reviewed it when he was almost about to break the plane to get a touchdown. His knee hit, and they called it back. Then this team proceeded to go ahead and run him on 4th and 1 to try to get into the end zone, and unfortunately was stuffed. And that's all she wrote. We could have ended up having a 10-plus point performance from Cordarrelle Patterson. And, those are pretty, common. This last week's performance is only the 3rd time this year that he's produced less than 10 fantasy points. In fact, less than 11 fantasy points. All in all, I think there's a very good chance that Cordarrelle Patterson, against a very soft matchup like the Detroit Lions, should be able to succeed as our number 8. Moving on to Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, despite all that has happened in this backfield, despite the fact that he's been dealing with a knee injury and illness, was still able to put up 14 fantasy points. That's 34 in the last 2 weeks overall, scoring 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. he's continuing to be a mainstay in this offense. And what I noticed more than anything is obviously he out-touched A.J. Dillon on the ground, though A.J. Dillon was able to get the red zone rushing attempts and obviously got the red zone rushing touchdown. It looks like Aaron Jones is finally kind of getting closer to his full state in which he completely dominates this backfield, mainly because his snap counts are increasing. Obviously, it's not at the rate in which it was earlier this season, where he was about 65% of the offensive snaps, because A.J. Dillon has obviously proven that he deserves to have more opportunities in this backfield, but we're certainly getting back to that point. And once, in fact, we do against the Cleveland Browns this week, giving up the 11th most points to opposing running backs, I think Aaron Jones very easily, whether it is on the ground, through the air, he is a touchdown fiend and will continue to find fantasy value. Moving on to Nick Chubb on the other side of the matchup. Of course, Nick Chubb last night had himself a great game against the Las Vegas Raiders. It was an easy matchup and should have had over 22 fantasy points. They had a rushing touchdown of Nick Chubb's called back due to an offensive holding by one of his offensive linemen. I think it was Wyatt Teller. Either way, he could have had himself 20 plus points very easily. But the thing that I wanted to mention in regards to Nick Chubb is because there's two sides to the coin here with Nick Chubb. There's Nick Chubb by himself in this backfield, and there's Nick Chubb with Kareem Hunt in the backfield. This season, in games where Nick Chubb has not had Kareem Hunt in the lineup, he's been averaging 18.48 fantasy points per game and has scored 4 touchdowns in 4 games. When Kareem Hunt has been active and in the lineup, he's only averaged 13.31 fantasy points per game and 4 touchdowns in 7 games. There is a huge disparity there in which 5 points, almost a touchdown pretty much per game, is being siphoned away from Nick Chubb when we have Kareem Hunt active. Hopefully, for many of our cases who have Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt won't be there. But if Kareem Hunt is going to be active, there is a possibility against Green Bay that we may even see Nick Chubb be a lesser overall option, and instead of being number 10, could be a lower play. Either way, I'm anticipating that regardless, with Kevin Stefanski back and this entire offense, whether it is at quarterback, offensive line, wide receiver, kind of being replenished and back into the lineup, the Cleveland Browns will put up a fight against the Green Bay Packers. Moving on to Javonte Williams, our number 11. Again, like I mentioned last week, I expect Javonte Williams to get majority of the touches out of this backfield going forward, and that's exactly what he did. He had himself 19 total touches. That is elite level work. And all he needed is a touchdown to get himself to that 16, 17 point overall play. And that's what I anticipate to see this upcoming week against the Las Vegas Raiders that are giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs. Like I just mentioned, Nick Chubb went for 91 yards and a touchdown, had himself 15.1 fantasy points, and honestly could have had himself a 2nd touchdown if it wasn't for that bogus holding call. All in all, there's a lot of potential here. I mean, since week 12, Javonte Williams has been averaging 19.08 half PPR fantasy points in the NFL, and he's just been taking over. Obviously, he is the primary receiving back in this offense, and when we see Drew Lock as the quarterback under center, they're probably going to be in a scenario in which they have to run the ball, keep the ball out of Drew Lock's hands so he doesn't make any mistakes, and just let the running game dominate. Moving on to Najee Harris, our number 12, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. As of late, the Kansas City Chiefs, they have been giving up points to opposing running backs. They've been giving up yards on the ground. Specifically, Denver went for 137 on the ground against them. And the Los Angeles Chargers this last week went for 166 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Now, in 2 out of the last 4 weeks, they've also taken on the Las Vegas Raiders. And in those 2 games combined, the Las Vegas Raiders were only able to run for 65 total yards. I mean, yes, they exposed them mainly because the game script led to that. When the Kansas City Chiefs come out and they dominate and they have a huge lead in the first half, all they have to do is kill clock in the second half, which forces opposing offensive coordinators to abandon the running game. If we get into a scenario in which, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers defense cannot stop the Kansas City Chiefs, then Najee Harris could be very similar to what he was last week, 12 carries for 18 yards, and pretty much not vital in the offense. The only difference here between the Los Angeles Chargers and the Denver Broncos offenses and running attacks in comparison to Pittsburgh is that, we all know Los Angeles Chargers and Denver Broncos have significantly better offensive lines, which obviously helps their respective running backs. But either way, the opportunity is going to be there for Najee Harris. If the Pittsburgh Steelers defense shows up and Patrick Mahomes wants to take the week off, Najee Harris could be in a better position to score some fantasy points for us. Moving on to our RB2 conversation, beginning with James Conner. Look, I think James Conner is incredible, but there is a absolute narrative here in comparison to when we see James Conner alone and with Chase Edmonds. This season, in the games without Chase Edmonds, 5 of them, in fact, he's been averaging 23.44 fantasy points per game. In the 9 games with Chase Edmonds, he's been averaging 10.86 fantasy points per game. I mean, that's a 13-point difference. I mean, that in itself is an unbelievable stat alone. But I still think James Conner will find success. We have to be careful, though. The Indianapolis Colts, if we look at their last couple matchups, outside of the game in which they took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they truly haven't been giving up many points. Since week 8, Besides that Tampa Bay Buccaneers game, they only gave up 2 touchdowns in the 6 other matchups and have been only giving up 58 rushing yards per game on average on a weekly basis. It's a pretty tough matchup, and I think Indianapolis obviously shutting down Rhamondre Stevenson last week wasn't an accident. It was obviously their defense showing their colors and really proving that they're nobody to mess with. Either way, I think James Conner, of all the running backs that are left that I haven't mentioned, has the highest upside for a touchdown, and when that's potentially possible, the work he's getting in the receiving game, the yards he'll get on the ground, he's certainly in the conversation of maybe getting into that top 12 position. Moving on to Joe Mixon, takes on the Baltimore Ravens. Again, it's the second toughest matchup at the position. I don't really like it very much. Even with the fact that, yes, Joe Mixon found success against Baltimore Ravens in Week 7, in which he had 12 carries, 59 yards, and a touchdown, 11.9 fantasy points, in a 41-17 victory. I'm still worried because I don't know if Joe Mixon's even playing. Is his ankle going to hold up? Is Samaje Perine going to be in the backfield? Is the matchup in which, yes, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon both scored a touchdown against the Baltimore Ravens last week, is that 24 points and 2 touchdowns? Is that a fluke? Or are the Baltimore Ravens going to continue to give up those kind of numbers? Because let's not forget, Calais Campbell, one of the Baltimore Ravens' better interior defensive linemen, was out. There are a lot of pieces that will be returning to this Baltimore Ravens defense, specifically in terms of stopping the run. And if and when that's the case, it may be more difficult for Joe Burrow and this offense to move the ball on the ground. May have to go ahead and go after those cornerbacks with, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, in order to get themselves in a successful position. And maybe Joe Mixon may be an afterthought, but we'll have to wait and see. Moving on, we have Ezekiel Elliott as our number 15. Zeke, finally, it's been a while. We've been saying it every week, but he finally did it. He finally surpassed 51 rushing yards in a game. This last week had himself 16 carries for 52 rushing yards. A rushing touchdown obviously was what he needed in his performance to get him to that 14.7 range. Otherwise, we get a, below 10-point performance, obviously, from Zeke Elliott once again. The stat that kind of surprised me this last week that I found via Next Gen Stats was that Zeke Elliott this season has seen far less 8-man in the box in terms of percentages this season in comparison to Tony Pollard. Defenses are stacking the box more against Tony Pollard than they are Zeke because they know Zeke's not going anywhere. They know that he's lost a step. They know he's injured. And that is what we've seen. But either way, take it on the Washington football team. There's always a potential in which this man's going to run for 50 yards, get himself a couple catches, and hopefully fall into the end zone for us. Moving on to our number 16, we have Antonio Gibson. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know the results of the game because it hasn't even happened yet. I'm recording this before the game. So Antonio Gibson could go for 3 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns tonight. I don't know. But a safe position going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, in my opinion, is that Antonio Gibson is probably going to be their only offensive piece that will find success. Mainly because J.D. McKissic with the concussion is going to the injured reserve, and Antonio Gibson really is the identity of this offense. Behind a great offensive line, running the ball is basically where they're going to find their success. And hopefully they'll continue to buy into that and give this man 25 to 28 touches per game to get him on that pace, because the last time he took on the Dallas Cowboys, he was pretty much phased out of the offensive scheme. And we got into a position where, Taylor Heinicke was making a lot of mistakes, a lot of incompletions, and the game got out of hand and the game script got away from Antonio Gibson. Hopefully that won't be the case this week, as Gibson will have a good opportunity for success. Moving on to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, taking on the second easiest matchup at the position against Pittsburgh. Again, the Pittsburgh Steelers on a weekly basis, they're giving up a boatload of points. Obviously, over 100 yards per game on average, over a touchdown per game on average to opposing running backs. The stat that I wanted to mention in regards to CEH. Last week against the Los Angeles Chargers, though he only scored 8 fantasy points, he played 71% of the snaps. If he was given more opportunity in terms of running the ball and the Kansas City Chiefs weren't in a position where they were trying to catch up, then I think CEH would be in a better position. And I think going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, we should see a position in which Kansas City is leading and able to run the ball out. And with that, since week 11, since Clyde Edwards has come back from his injury, he's been averaging about 12.5 fantasy points per game. And that's what we're hoping to potentially see. Get your yardage, get your touchdown, and get out. And that's what we're hoping with Clyde Edwards at number 17. Moving on to David Montgomery. Again, David Montgomery has been extremely underwhelming, to say the very least. Luckily, he takes on Seattle. They give up the 4th most points per game to opposing running backs. Obviously, David Montgomery is going to be given an opportunity. This is the second consecutive week in which he's had over 5 receptions out of this backfield. As long as he continues to get that work, his baseline of production is obviously going to increase. He did, unfortunately fumble last night. That is something that we're going to have to deal with. But the offense as a whole had so many opportunities to score. Chicago just continued to throw them away. And hopefully, this upcoming week in Seattle will be able to act upon them, because a running back that is getting 23 touches shouldn't be getting less than 10 fantasy points. They should very easily surpass 10 points and have the upside of getting that touchdown into the 15-point range. And that's what I hopefully expect from David Montgomery in an upside potential. Moving on to Damien Harris. If he's healthy and playing against the Buffalo Bills, I mean, the last time he took them on, he had a huge 70-yard run, had himself a lot of potential growth to have even after that huge run because they were running all over Buffalo's defense. The Buffalo Bills this season have already proven that when it gets to smash mouth football, their defense cannot show up. I've talked about it before. Matt Milano, he used to be a safety in college. They have a small defense and they don't have guys that can come up, step up into the box and stop the run. And hopefully, like the New England Patriots did a couple weeks ago, they run the ball 38 times on Buffalo. Obviously, with a healthy Damien Harris, the sky's the limit for his overall potential. Moving on to Sony Michel. You know what? To be honest, it doesn't matter who's in this position. Darrell Henderson, Sony Michel. This is number 20, the Los Angeles Rams starting running back. If we get into a position later tonight in which the game happens and we see a running back by committee, then they're both washed. But if one takes over the job over the other, then we'll go ahead and play them in this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, and we'll be happy with it. But overall, it doesn't matter. I think whoever is the starting back of this team is going to have themselves 15 total opportunities, goal line work because of how potent this offense has been. Of course, Matthew Stafford scoring 3 touchdowns in 3 consecutive weeks obviously presents more and more opportunity for them to keep getting down to the red zone and scoring. I think whoever the starting running back is, Sony Michel, Darrell Henderson, they have a lot of opportunity going into this week. Moving on to Josh Jacobs. Unfortunately, was kind of phased out. It was a little bit of a lower scoring game, but really the ball just couldn't be moved by the Las Vegas Raiders. I mean, Hunter Renfrow, nowhere to be found. Darren Waller, obviously still out with an injury. Foster Moreau, Zay Jones, obviously down on the goal line, was able to score a touchdown. Hopefully, we'll get more involvement in which Josh Jacobs is finding the end zone because that is purely where he succeeds. If he's not able to find the end zone, 10 points is pretty much where he's going to sit at. And if he finds the end zone, like I mentioned with David Montgomery, Damien Harris, they get into that 15-point range in which they're beautiful plays at a lower-end RB2 status. Either way, number 21 seems perfect for Josh Jacobs. Moving on, A.J. Dillon. Like I mentioned in regards to Aaron Jones earlier, A.J. Dillon had both of the red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line for the Green Bay Packers this past Sunday. And that gives me a lot of confidence because he was able to score a rushing touchdown. And though he only had 7 rushing attempts in the game for 22 yards, it still gives me confidence, especially considering they're going against the Cleveland Browns. It should be a matchup in which obviously Green Bay should run all over this team and run through them. And that'll give a lot of opportunity for A.J. Dillon in the second half in which he'll be able to step up and continue to contribute to our fantasy point totals. He's a great running back. He's just got to get his opportunities. And when you get over that 10, 12, total touches per game, have red zone potential upside, he's an automatic play. Moving on to our number 23, we have Melvin Gordon III. He's coming off of a week in which he had 15 total rushing attempts. And though the yardage was only 53 yards and 6.6 fantasy points, when I think about his overall opportunity, 16 total touches, if he's able to get into a matchup like he is this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs over the last 7 matchups, there's a great opportunity for him to not only have his 15 rushing attempts, his 50 yards, but get himself a rushing touchdown and get himself as a relevant running back. For many of us, it is going to be difficult to play Melvin Gordon considering it is a kind of committee scenario, but based on the fact that this team is a run-first approach, I expect Melvin Gordon to still have himself a pretty decent overall value. Moving on to Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary, off of the last 2 weeks, playing 82% and 93% of the offensive snaps, has proven that he is going to be the lead running back for this offense. He's coming off of a week in which he had career high in rushing attempts, 22 rushing attempts for 86 yards and a rushing touchdown for 16.1 fantasy points. On top of that, the New England Patriots, they're giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs, mainly because they cannot stop the run. Since week 8, they've been giving up 5.44 yards per carry to opposing running backs on a weekly basis. And that also includes the fact that, this is a team in Buffalo that sure may not look like a team that wants to run the ball, but when push comes to shove, they'll have to when they get into the playoffs. And I think they're beginning to warm up to that idea with Devin Singletary as of late. Moving on, we have our number 25, Rashaad Penny. Again, I don't know what the results are of tonight's game. It hasn't happened yet. So what exactly is Rashaad Penny going to be able to do the following week after he takes on the Rams? Well, hopefully he'll get a good amount of opportunity tonight, hopefully find the end zone, and if he's able to do so, he should be higher ranked than number 25. But if he's not able to, because again, the Los Angeles Rams only give up about 3.07 yards per carry to opposing running backs, then maybe the Chicago Bears matchup, who are giving up the 16th most points to opposing running backs, may shine a little bit more light on his overall potential. Either way, I think Rashaad Penny, considering the fact that Alex Collins, Travis Homer, DJ Dallas, Adrian Peterson, whoever the heck is in this backfield, these guys are all washed. Rashaad Penny needs to continue to step up. And as long as he's being given the opportunity to do so, then by all means, he's in my starting lineup against the Chicago Bears in Week 16. The potential of his upside is certainly going to be there, considering how much Pete Carroll wants to run the ball. He always mentions it every single week. We got to run the ball more. And with Penny stepping up, hopefully that'll be the case. Moving on to Miles Sanders, our number 26. Again, similar scenario. I don't know how the game's going because it hasn't happened yet. So what exactly are we going to do with Miles Sanders? If we end up seeing a running back by committee tonight with Jordan Howard, Boston Scott, Kenneth Gainwell, Miles Sanders, then we'll be in trouble. But hopefully it won't be, and Miles Sanders will be the lead back. And in that specific scenario, we'll have Miles Sanders, who, again, is taking on the New York Giants, giving up the 7th most points to opposing running backs, a great matchup, a great running back. And if in fact he is healthy, he could very easily be a top 24 play. But we sit him at 26 until we get some further information. Again, ranking subject to change. Moving on. Devonta Freeman is our number 27. This is a player that is coming off of 2 out of the last 3 weeks being over 100 rushing yards. He's been playing incredibly. 2 catches for 27 to get 14.5 fantasy points this last week, even without scoring a touchdown. That, in my opinion, it just leads me to believe that regardless of who you put in this backfield, this Tennessee Titans running attack is obviously potent. And even with Dontrell Hilliard and Jeremy McNichols getting touches out of this backfield, both of them combining for 15 total rushing attempts, Devonta Freeman still found himself an incredible amount of value and will continue to do so this upcoming week against the San Francisco 49ers. I know that he had popped up on the injury report with an ankle injury. He fully participated today, so he should be fine. Moving on to Saquon Barkley, our number 28. As long as Saquon Barkley is getting touches, sure, he's going to have great opportunity. In the last 4 weeks, these are his total touches: 17, 17, 19, and 19. These are his total yardage counts: 53, 74, 95, 74. So overall, he's going to get himself, on average, about 7.5 fantasy points per game just off of yardage. If he's able to get himself a couple receptions, sure, he gets that 10-point range, but then he needs a touchdown. But unfortunately, with Mike Glennon probably the starting quarterback for this offense for the rest of the season, and the fact that they take on Philadelphia next week, there's a potential in which Saquon just maybe isn't enough. And when you see Devontae Booker coming in, taking 10 touches per game out of this backfield, getting a lot of receiving work, having himself big major runs, and obviously earning himself more opportunity, it leans us away from Saquon. It makes it, yes, we're hoping for 7.5 to 10 points, but it's almost a miracle if we were able to get a touchdown, considering the last time he scored a touchdown was with 1 minute left on the clock and wide open in the back of the end zone. Moving on to number 29, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. I know that there's conversations about Elijah Mitchell coming back, but he's a game time decision and they play on Thursday. Typically, when there's a game time decision for Thursday games, we typically don't see that running back end up participating and or playing. This team is on fire and they're continuing to win every single week. Jeff Wilson obviously coming off of a great performance of 21 carries for 110 yards. Why couldn't you do that against Jacksonville? Why couldn't you do that the week before this, in which we all counted on you? Unfortunately, he ended up having a great week when we all, just didn't even pay attention to Jeff Wilson. Either way, he takes on Tennessee. It may be time to continue to ignore Jeff Wilson because Tennessee is the best defense in terms of stopping the run this season, only giving up 3.01 yards per carry in the last 7 games. Overall, Tennessee they don't give up many yards. But on the other end, the San Francisco 49ers are a run-first team, and they're the best at that. I mean, when you have Trent Williams just running over defenders every single week as a starting left tackle, one of the best in the National Football League, if not the best. You have George Kittle, Kyle Juszczyk, some of the better, blocking Swiss Army knives in the National Football League. It does present an argument in which maybe they're able to run the ball with Deebo Samuel back there, with the potential of them throwing more. Jeff Wilson sits at number 29. Moving on, Michael Carter. Michael Carter did not do enough in Sunday's game to convince me that he's going to be the starter going forward. It may be a scenario in which him and Tevin Coleman are splitting. And if that's going to be the case, well, Jacksonville's not the easiest matchup in the world. And it is kind of concerning for his potential going into this upcoming week. Either way, if he ends up taking the starting job, then by all means, Michael Carter should be a decent top 30 play. But outside of that, as a running back by committee, a Jets running back isn't that valuable. Moving on to Devonta Freeman. Again, if Lamar Jackson's in the backfield, maybe he has more opportunity. But last week, against the Green Bay Packers in a matchup where they were trying to come back the entire game, his opportunity was non-existent. Only 6 rushing attempts, only 1 catch, despite the fact he had the 3rd most routes run amongst all running backs in Week 15. Even with that, was only able to put up 2.9 fantasy points. Unless this man scores a touchdown, he's pretty much a lower-end RB3. Moving on to Tony Pollard at number 32. I wanted to mention, Tony Pollard in the first half had 8 total touches. In the second half, had 7 total touches. So I don't want to get the idea that Tony Pollard wasn't only given touches because they were blowing out the New York Giants. That wasn't the case. Tony Pollard gets touches across the board. And what's promising is the last time that the Dallas Cowboys took on the Washington football team, obviously Tony Pollard was injured, but Corey Clement was active and he had himself 14 total touches. Obviously, Tony Pollard coming off a week with 15 total touches, very easily can get into that conversation. Obviously, touchdown upside doesn't really exist amongst Cowboys players as they aren't able to score consistently, but hopefully the yardage can carry him. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson. If we get into a scenario in which, of course, we're running the ball 30 plus times between Damien Harris and Rhamondre Stevenson, he could very easily have a great amount of value against a defense that cannot stop the run. He also has the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield, and if he's able to commit to that, we could end up seeing a decent performance here out of Rhamondre Stevenson after this unfortunate performance against Indianapolis. Moving on to Myles Gaskin. I don't know what we're going to see from the Dolphins, and that's why I put Myles Gaskin at 34. Besides the fact that they take on the New Orleans Saints, one of the tougher matchups at the running back position, he has to split carries with Duke Johnson. With that up in the air, I leave him at 34 and leave it up to you as to how much risk you're willing to kind of play and what kind of reward you could potentially even get from a running back playing against New Orleans. Moving on to Devontae Booker. I mean, again, like I've mentioned, this is a guy that's had 9.2 fantasy points in each of the last 2 weeks minimum. As long as he is getting the opportunities that he is seeing, he's delivering on them. He's played incredibly well all season long. Even when, Saquon Barkley is in the lineup or Saquon is out with an injury, Devontae Booker has proven to us that he's worthy of a top 36 ranking. Moving on to our final running back, it is Chase Edmonds. Now, a lot of players could have been here. I could have put Justin Jackson here. I could have put a Houston running back here. I could have put a variety of players. But for right now, I think that the implementation of Chase Edmonds in this backfield is going to be something that we want to keep our eye on, because I really do think that Chase Edmonds is going to dig into the overall upside of James Conner, which is why I have James Conner where he is currently ranked for this week. But either way, I think going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Indianapolis, when it is difficult to run the ball, there may be a scenario in which Chase Edmonds, of course, with a week under his belt, gets into the backfield and starts running more routes out of the slot position, out of the backfield, and presenting himself as more of a fantasy upside option. All right, now that we've covered our top 36 rankings, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel and, of course, taking time out of your day to support me via your viewership. Either way, be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today, and Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit, whether it is the weekly contest, the pick'ems. Check it out. Have some fun with that. And, of course, explore some more fantasy upside there. Outside of that, we're good to go. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the wide receiver position. Hopefully, tonight's games are entertaining. Unlike Monday night's games, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.